Hey guys, so today we're going to go over day 3 notes, how to balance chemical equations. So yesterday's notes, you guys should have learned how to write chemical equations. So today we're going to learn how to balance those chemical equations. Okay, so for the sake of time, I'm just going to give you the key for the notes. So that way, because a lot of it is just vocabulary and then these 4 steps to balance equations. So first off, conservation of atoms. Okay, so conservation of atoms is the number of each type of atom on the reactant side of the chemical equation must be equal to the number of each type of atom on the product side of the equation. So basically that's saying that if you have 2 atoms of hydrogen on your reactant side, then on your product side you should also have 2 hydrogen atoms. So 2 and 2. 2 on the product side, 2 on the reactant side. Okay, coefficient, you guys should know what a coefficient is by now. It represents the number of units of each substance taking part in the reaction. Okay, it's the big number in front of our equations. Okay, and then lastly we have balanced chemical equation. That's the same number of atoms of each element on both sides of the equation. So balanced chemical equation and then conservation of atoms, it's kind of the same thing. Okay, you have to have the same number of atoms on each side. Okay, so like I was saying earlier, if you have 2 hydrogen atoms on your reactant side, you should also have 2 hydrogen atoms on your product side. Okay, so our 4 steps to balancing chemical equations. Your first step is to set up your equation. Okay, but most of the time your equation is already going to be given to you. So if it's not, then you are going to have to write an equation out yourself. Okay, so step 2, you have to count the number of atoms you have on both sides of your equation. Okay, so that's always your first step, because that's when you need to figure out, okay, what's not balanced, what is uneven. Okay, next step, step 3, balance by changing the coefficients and recounting your atoms. Okay, because if you change the number of coefficients, a lot of the times our equations are going to have compounds. So those compounds, if you change one element, then the other element in that compound is also going to change. Okay, so that's why we would have to recount. And then step 4, start the process again if it is still not balanced. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at these examples then. Okay, so now I'm actually going to switch over to our actual notes. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at our first example right here. N2 plus H2 yields NH3. Okay, so is this chemical equation balanced? No. We can take a look. Nitrogen, we only have 2 on this side. Okay, and we also have 2 hydrogens on this side. But when we look at our product side, we'll notice we only have 1 nitrogen and 3 hydrogens. Okay, so our equation is definitely not balanced. Okay, so remember our first step is to set up your equation, but our equation is already given to us. Our next step, step number 2, count the number of atoms you have on both sides of the equation. Okay, so I have nitrogen and I have hydrogen. So on my reactant side, I have 2 nitrogens, and then again on my reactant side, I have 2 hydrogens. Okay, so on our product side, we only have 1 nitrogen and 3 hydrogens. Okay, so we can see that both of our elements are not balanced. Okay, so to balance our equation, we're going to have to multiply. So in the case of nitrogen, we have 2 nitrogens on our reactant side, but only 1 on our product side. So that means we're going to have to multiply by 2 to make this even. Okay, so that way we have 2 nitrogens on our reactant side and 2 nitrogens on our product side. So whatever you multiplied with, we multiplied by 2. That's going to become your coefficient now for your product side. But notice, because I put that 2 there, what does it change? It changes the number of hydrogen atoms I have. So instead of just having 3 hydrogen atoms now, I now have 6. Okay, so cross that 3 out, I now have 6. Okay, so now that my nitrogen is balanced, I can move on to my hydrogen atoms. So if I have 6 on my product side and I only have 2 on my reactant side, then that means I'm going to have to multiply by 3 to equal 6. Okay, so remember, whatever I multiply with, that's going to be my coefficient. Okay, so I multiplied by 3 for hydrogen. I'm now going to have a coefficient of 3 for H2. Okay, so you can always check your work at the end. I have 2 nitrogens on both sides of my equation, and then I have 6 hydrogens on both sides of my equation, right? You can also look at your equation up top to look at that. 2 nitrogens, 2 nitrogens. Okay, 3 times 2, that's 6 hydrogens, and then 2 times 3, that's 6 hydrogens there as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue. Let's do a few more examples. Okay, so number 1 for guided practice. Okay, so I have H2 plus O2 yields H2O. Okay, so again, I already have an equation, so there's no need to do step 1. Step 2, count the number of atoms I have. So I have hydrogen and I have oxygen. Okay, so on my reactant side, I have 2 hydrogens. On my reactant side, I have 2 oxygens as well. Okay, on my product side, I have 2 hydrogens and only 1 oxygen. Okay, so hydrogen is balanced. We can skip that because it's already balanced. But my oxygen is not balanced. So that means I'm going to have to multiply my product side by 2, so that way I can have 2 oxygens on both sides of my equation. Okay, but because I put that 2 there, it changes the number of hydrogens I have. So I no longer have 2 hydrogens, but 4. Okay, so because that changed to a 4, that means my hydrogens are unbalanced. So what do I have to multiply by to equal 4? I'm going to have to multiply my reactant side by 2, so that way I can also have 4 hydrogens on my reactant side. Okay, and then remember, whatever you multiply with becomes your coefficient. Okay, so again, you can always check your work again. Okay, so 2 times 2, that's 4 hydrogens. And then on my product side, 2 times 2, that's also 4 hydrogens. Oxygen, I only have 2 on my reactant side, so on my product side, I still have 2. Okay, so moving on to number 2. Okay, I have magnesium plus HCl yields H2 plus magnesium chloride. Okay, so I have magnesium, I have hydrogen, and I have chlorine. So on my reactant side, I only have 1 magnesium, 1 hydrogen, and 1 chlorine. On my product side, I have 2 hydrogens, 1 magnesium, and 2 chlorines. Okay, so let's take a look at our atoms. Okay, magnesium is already balanced. We have 1 and 1, so we can go ahead and skip magnesium. Hydrogen, on the other hand, is not balanced, so that means we're going to have to multiply this by 2 so we can have an even number of atoms on each side. So whatever I multiplied with becomes my coefficient. So because I changed that coefficient, it also changes the number of chlorines I have. So chlorine now has 2 atoms as well. Okay, so it looks like everything else is balanced. So that would complete my my equation. Okay, so let's see if I can autofocus. Okay, there you go. Okay, and then lastly, I have sodium plus HCl yields sodium chloride plus hydrogen. Okay, so again, we got to figure out how many of each atom do I have. So I have sodium, I have hydrogen, and I have chlorine. So for sodium, I have 1 on my reactant side. Hydrogen, I also have 1. And chlorine, I still have 1. Okay, now on my product side, I have 1 sodium, 1 chlorine, and 2 hydrogens. Okay, so sodium is already balanced, so we can skip sodium, but hydrogen needs to be multiplied by 2 because they are not balanced. So because I multiplied by 2, that means my coefficient for hydrogen needs to change to a 2. Because I changed that coefficient to a 2, I now have 2 chlorines. Okay, but because I changed the number of chlorines, then that means I'm going to have to multiply my product side by 2 now. Okay, so now 2 and 2, my chlorines are now balanced. But because, again, I changed that coefficient, it changes the number of sodium atoms I have. So I no longer have 1, but 2. And because that changed to a 2, then that means I have to balance it out by multiplying this side by 2. Okay, so because I multiplied by 2, my coefficient changes to a 2. Okay, so according to my work, everything should be balanced now. Everything has 2 atoms of each. Okay, all right, so that concludes our notes for today. If you have any questions, please ask.